It is the year 920, and the wind sweeping across the far north of Europe never asks permission before forcing its way through the cracks of timber and turf homes, smothering the fire, stiffening children's hands, and reminding every living soul that nature has never shown favoritism. You are standing beside a Norwegian fjord where the water is almost black beneath a sky that struggles to remember daylight for months at a time, while the scent of smoke, damp earth, and preserved fish drifts through the cold air. This is the Viking world, but what if almost everything you think you know about it tells only part of the story? You have probably heard about fearless raiders who crossed open seas, unmatched sailors whose longships struck distant shores with terrifying precision. And although that image contains truth, it leaves behind an entire half of this civilization buried with the women who carried its greatest burdens while the men disappeared beyond the horizon. Their lives rarely survived into films, video games, or schoolbooks, even though they held together everything that remained standing when the ships were gone. So who were the Viking women living in the year 920, and why does the answer become darker the closer we look? Were they warriors, servants, queens, or something far more difficult than any single word can contain, because the reality refuses to fit comfortably inside those familiar labels? As you continue, you will discover that the most unsettling battles were not always fought with swords, but inside homes, families, and expectations that shaped every day of their existence. What appears obvious at first will soon reveal itself as only the surface of a much deeper and far more disturbing history. Whenever Viking men sailed away on expeditions for trade, settlement, or war, the villages they left behind never slowed down, because the silence they created demanded even greater effort from those who remained. Women became responsible for the land, the livestock, the children, the harvest, negotiations with neighboring families, and the careful management of every resource that stood between survival and disaster. It may sound like influence, but before you mistake it for comfort, ask yourself what that responsibility truly meant when winter was already approaching. Archaeologists have uncovered iron keys hanging from women's belts throughout Scandinavia, and those keys were never worn as decoration because they represented control over food stores, valuables, and the family's entire future. Whoever carried them decided what could be used, what had to be saved, and how long everyone under that roof might endure when supplies began to disappear. It was authority in the clearest sense imaginable, but it came wrapped in a burden few people today could genuinely comprehend. Picture yourself carrying those keys while your husband has been gone for months without a single message. Your children grow weaker each day. The harvest has failed to meet expectations, and every neighbor understands exactly what desperation looks like before it speaks its first word. The influence Viking women possessed was inseparable from relentless isolation, because every decision carried consequences that could determine whether an entire household survived until spring. Could anyone truly call that freedom, or was it simply another form of captivity hidden behind responsibility? Norse sagas, Eddic poetry, and the observations left by travelers such as Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Viking communities only a few years later, describe women who stood at the center of a society built around absence, where men leaving home was not an exception but the ordinary rhythm of life. That reality placed them in a strange position, giving them authority without reliable protection, demanding resilience without recognition, and expecting unwavering strength while offering almost no praise in return. And this is only the beginning of a story that grows far more unsettling with every step. To understand what these women faced, you first need to understand that Viking society was divided by rigid social boundaries, and those divisions weighed even more heavily on women because class and gender shaped their lives at the same time. Near the top stood free women from established families, often able to inherit property, seek divorce under certain circumstances, speak in legal matters, and in rare documented cases even oversee entire communities when no male leader was present. Does that sound like remarkable independence? Or are we still looking at only one carefully illuminated corner of a much darker picture? Recent archaeological research, including DNA studies of Scandinavian burials, has revealed that several women were laid to rest with weapons, horses, and objects associated with prestige, suggesting that female roles in Viking society were more complex than historians once believed. Yet every celebrated burial hides another reality, because for each woman remembered through remarkable discoveries, countless others disappeared without recognition beneath a system that rarely preserved their names. Once you see who those forgotten women were, the entire image of the Viking world begins to change. Beneath those privileged households existed another layer so vast that it supported much of the Viking economy while remaining almost invisible in popular history: the enslaved women known as thralls. Slavery was not an occasional practice or a distant exception, but one of the foundations upon which wealth, labor, and expansion depended throughout the Viking world. Once you recognize how many lives were shaped by that reality, every familiar image of Viking society begins to look very different. Many of these women had been taken during raids across Ireland, England, the Frankish coast, and Slavic territories, torn away from their homes in a single violent day before being carried into a land whose language, customs, and brutal winters were completely foreign to them. Their names rarely entered the sagas, their graves were seldom marked, and the history that celebrated famous warriors almost never paused to remember those who lost everything without ever holding a weapon. Can you imagine waking one morning in your own village and ending that same day knowing you would never see it again? Life inside a Viking household demanded endless physical labor from an enslaved woman who ground grain, wove cloth, prepared meals, cleaned, cared for children who were not her own, and often endured sexual exploitation without any legal protection or meaningful possibility of refusal. Escape was extraordinarily difficult because isolated settlements, unfamiliar landscapes, and tightly connected communities left almost nowhere to run, while survival depended entirely on the decisions of those who owned her. The keys that symbolized authority for one woman became the invisible chains that defined another, and the distance between them was far greater than the walls of the same house could ever reveal. One of the most disturbing truths hidden inside this world is that these two women often lived beneath the same roof, while occupying entirely different realities, each trapped inside roles they had never chosen, yet separated by a gulf so wide that genuine solidarity became almost impossible. The mistress of the household depended upon the labor of the enslaved woman to keep everything functioning, while the enslaved woman depended upon the mistress's mercy to avoid punishment, sale, or something even worse. It was not friendship, but a silent negotiation inside an invisible prison where survival itself became the only common language. The system that sustained this relationship reached far beyond a single village, because Viking trading centers such as Hedeby and Birka became major hubs in an international network where enslaved people were bought, sold, and transported across enormous distances. Merchants carried human beings toward the Islamic world, Byzantium, and other markets, where the value of a healthy young woman could be calculated in silver or livestock with the same cold precision used for any other commodity. What does it reveal about a civilization when a person's worth can be reduced to a price without anyone questioning the calculation itself? Yet an equally unsettling layer still remains hidden beneath everything we have explored so far, because even women born free lived under pressures that history often describes far too gently. Marriage was rarely understood as a personal journey or a romantic choice, but as an agreement designed to preserve alliances, strengthen families, and protect survival in an uncertain world. The deeper you look into those arrangements, the more complicated the idea of freedom becomes. By the year 920, a free Norse girl was often promised in marriage while still barely entering adolescence, not because love stood at the center of the arrangement, but because families relied on these unions to secure political ties, strengthen alliances, and protect their future. Some sagas preserve stories of women refusing a proposed husband with the support of their relatives, yet those choices existed only within narrow limits defined by the willingness of the family to listen. Even when a woman possessed a voice, how much freedom did that voice truly carry if someone else still controlled the final decision? Marriage immediately placed enormous expectations upon her shoulders, requiring her to oversee the household, raise heirs, preserve the honor of the family, welcome travelers according to sacred customs of hospitality, and maintain delicate relationships with the clan she had left behind. Every responsibility overlapped with the next, leaving almost no room for failure because a household that weakened during a husband's absence reflected directly upon the woman who remained to govern it. Compassion rarely greeted mistakes in that world, and weakness was often judged far more harshly than misfortune itself. If her husband never returned from the sea or the battlefield, the burden did not disappear with him, but instead became even heavier, because alongside property, she could also inherit debts, enemies, unfinished obligations, and immediate pressure from both families to marry again before instability invited conflict. A woman managing land alone represented not only opportunity, but also vulnerability in the eyes of surrounding clans eager to challenge uncertain authority. The independence Viking women sometimes displayed was therefore often born not from unrestricted choice, but from necessity created when no one else remained to carry the weight. It was within that absence, however, that some women discovered something no one had deliberately granted them, and the evidence remained hidden for centuries before archaeologists understood what they were actually looking at. Across several Scandinavian burial sites dating to the Viking Age, researchers uncovered graves containing two bodies placed together, a pattern that at first seemed impossible to explain. What they eventually found would expose one of the darkest customs ever connected to the Viking world. DNA analysis and isotope studies revealed that in many of those graves the second individual was a young woman, frequently of foreign origin, showing no signs of illness or injuries from combat, and having died at precisely the same moment as the person whose funeral was taking place. Historical accounts, especially those written by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe this practice with unsettling detail, explaining how an enslaved woman could be selected, prepared with intoxicating drinks, and then ritually killed so that she would accompany her master into the next life. The most chilling part is not only what happened, but how calmly it was recorded, as though witnessing such a death required no expression of horror because it belonged to the accepted order of the world. Here the human and the brutal sides of Viking society collide without leaving any room for romantic interpretation, revealing the life of a woman whose identity was never considered separate from the person who owned her, even in death. She lived under someone else's authority, and when her life ended, the decision remained someone else's as well, leaving behind no heroic legend, only the silence of a system that consumed certain people completely from beginning to end. Faced with a world like this, how did any woman preserve a sense of self, dignity, or continuity without allowing that system to erase who she was? The answer survived in places that rarely drew attention, beginning with stories carried not on parchment but in memory, because Norse culture depended deeply upon spoken tradition passed from one generation to the next beside the fire. Women became some of the most important guardians of those narratives, preserving family histories, remembering old agreements, and ensuring that the honor of a clan did not disappear when the men who had defended it were absent or already gone. If memory determines how a people understand themselves, then who truly holds power over the future? The one who fights or the one who remembers? That influence also lived in work that modern eyes often dismiss as ordinary. Although weaving formed one of the essential foundations of the Viking economy rather than a simple domestic task, cloth produced by skilled women traveled across trading networks, served as a valuable commodity, and represented technical knowledge that required years of experience to master, making every finished length of fabric part of the wealth that sustained entire communities. Behind every thread lay countless hours of expertise, proving that survival depended not only on weapons crossing the sea, but also on hands working patiently at home. There was yet another place where female authority appeared with remarkable force, within the spiritual life of the Norse world, where the seeresses known as Volvas traveled from settlement to settlement and were welcomed with profound respect. Warriors, household leaders, and ordinary families sought their guidance before harvests, marriages, battles, and journeys, while even the mythology of the North described Odin himself pursuing the wisdom these women possessed. How could a society capable of honoring female insight so deeply also accept unimaginable suffering for so many other women without seeing any contradiction at all? Rather than resolving that contradiction, it exposes the deepest fracture within Viking society, revealing a culture capable of honoring a respected seer while condemning an enslaved woman to die beside the man who owned her. Those two realities existed at the same time without canceling one another, forcing us to confront a civilization that divided human worth into categories that could change everything about a person's life. Is that contradiction really confined to the Viking Age, or does it still echo in ways we are often unwilling to recognize? The discoveries made by archaeologists, historians, and genetic researchers over recent decades point toward a far more complicated reality than the legends most people inherited. Viking women were never a single, uniform group of fearless shield maidens or powerless victims, but an immense spectrum of lives shaped by birth, status, fortune, and circumstances beyond their control, connected only by the fact that they existed inside a society that seldom allowed them to define their own terms. Some gained genuine influence. Many endured with remarkable resilience inside painfully narrow spaces, and countless others vanished before history considered them worthy of remembrance. In the end, the lesson reaches far beyond the Viking world itself, because it asks what happens whenever a society decides that a person's value depends primarily on the usefulness they provide to someone else rather than on their humanity. Systems of power rarely survive through violence alone. They endure because repeated customs eventually stop looking like choices and begin to feel as though they have always been the natural order of things, even while individuals continue searching for small openings through which dignity, identity, and quiet resistance can still survive. That woman standing beside the fjord in the year 920, whether she carried the household keys, mastered the loom, wandered as a vulva, or lived nameless in bondage, deserved more than a simplified legend, and perhaps the least we can do today is finally see her without romance, without comforting illusions, and without looking away. When we look back across that frozen shoreline, the woman standing there no longer appears as a symbol from an old saga, but as someone carrying responsibilities almost impossible for us to imagine, whether she ruled a household, preserved ancient traditions, produced the cloth that sustained trade, or endured a life without freedom or recognition. Her world demanded endurance long before it offered respect, and every ordinary day required choices made beneath pressures that modern life rarely asks us to face. The farther we travel into her story, the more we realize that history has remembered her far less than she deserved. Perhaps that is why the greatest mistake we can make is reducing Viking women to a single image, because no single description can contain lives shaped by privilege, suffering, resilience, fear, duty, sacrifice, and survival all at once. Their experiences were not identical, and their destinies were never equal, yet each existed inside a system that constantly determined how much value society believed her life possessed before she had any chance to decide for herself. If history teaches anything here, is it really about the Vikings, or is it about how easily every civilization learns to normalize inequality when enough generations stop questioning it? If this journey has changed the way you see the Viking world, then perhaps the greatest discovery was never hidden beneath the soil of Scandinavia, but inside the stories we choose to tell and the people we choose to remember. Share the moment that surprised you most, because every perspective adds another piece to a history that has remained incomplete for far too long. And if you want to continue uncovering forgotten worlds where reality is often darker than legend, the next chapter is already waiting to take you even deeper into the past. The frozen wind that swept across the fjords more than 1,000 years ago has long since faded, yet the questions it leaves behind remain far more difficult to silence than the storms themselves. Every archaeological discovery, every surviving saga, and every forgotten grave pushes us toward the same realization. The lives of Viking women were never defined by a single role, but by a constant struggle to navigate a world that demanded everything from them, while rarely allowing them to choose the conditions under which they lived. And perhaps that is why their story continues to feel unexpectedly modern, because beneath the helmets, longships, and legends lies something profoundly human. It is easy to admire dramatic victories and legendary warriors, yet history often hides its greatest truths inside ordinary lives that never found a place in heroic songs. The woman locking the granary before another endless winter, the enslaved captive wondering whether tomorrow would bring another master, the skilled weaver whose cloth helped sustain an economy, and the wandering seer trusted with questions no warrior could answer all belonged to the same civilization, but they inhabited completely different realities. How many other histories have reached us in exactly the same way, preserving the voices of the powerful while allowing countless others to disappear into silence? The Viking world has fascinated generations because of its battles, voyages, and fearless explorers, but perhaps its most revealing story has always been the one unfolding quietly behind the doors of its homes, where endurance often demanded greater courage than combat ever could. Looking back without romanticizing that past does not diminish its greatness. Instead, it allows us to understand the extraordinary complexity of the people who lived through it and the systems that shaped every aspect of their existence. Once you see that hidden world, it becomes impossible to look at the familiar image of the Vikings in quite the same way again. The farther we move from the legends and closer to the evidence, the harder it becomes to divide Viking society into simple ideas of heroes and villains. Every excavation, every recovered object, and every surviving account reveals people living inside a system filled with contradictions, where strength and suffering often existed side by side, without ever canceling one another. Perhaps the real mystery was never how the Vikings conquered distant shores, but how so many women endured lives shaped by responsibilities and dangers that history almost allowed us to forget. That forgotten reality forces us to reconsider what endurance truly looks like, because courage is not always found on a battlefield or aboard a ship disappearing beyond the horizon. Sometimes it belongs to the woman who keeps an entire household alive through another brutal winter, to the captive who survives one more day despite having no control over her future, or to the keeper of stories whose memory preserves an entire community after those who fought are gone. When survival itself becomes the greatest achievement, how should history decide whose lives deserve to be remembered? The image of the Viking woman that survives today is therefore incomplete unless it includes every layer of her existence, from authority to vulnerability, from influence to exploitation, from respected wisdom to silent sacrifice. Only by accepting those contradictions can we begin to understand a civilization that was capable of remarkable achievement while simultaneously sustaining profound injustice. And perhaps that uncomfortable truth is exactly why this story still speaks so powerfully across more than 1,000 years, refusing to remain buried beneath the frozen earth where so much of it first came to light. The women of the Viking Age did not leave behind endless written testimonies describing their own lives, which is exactly why every fragment uncovered by archaeologists carries such extraordinary weight today. A key resting beside a skeleton, the pattern woven into ancient cloth, traces of foreign ancestry preserved in bone, or the arrangement of a burial can speak with surprising clarity when human voices have long since disappeared. Every discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that remained incomplete for centuries, reminding us how much history can hide simply because the people living it were never given the chance to record it themselves. For generations, the popular image of the Viking world was shaped almost entirely through the achievements of men whose journeys, battles, and political ambitions dominated surviving narratives. Women frequently appeared only at the edges of those stories, even though daily life depended upon their labor, judgment, and resilience every single day that the longships vanished beyond the horizon. Once the focus shifts toward the lives unfolding inside those settlements instead of the expeditions leaving them behind, an entirely different civilization begins to emerge before our eyes. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath centuries of myth, because history is rarely incomplete by accident, but often by the choices made about whose experiences deserve to be preserved. The farther we move away from simplified legends and toward the evidence left behind, the more clearly we understand that the Viking world cannot be explained through conquest alone, since its true foundation also rested upon countless women whose names were forgotten, while their work continued shaping the lives of everyone around them. And once those forgotten voices begin to return, the familiar story of the Vikings is transformed forever. Looking back across more than 1,000 years, it becomes clear that the greatest misunderstanding about Viking women was never that history forgot them entirely, but that it remembered only the versions that fit comfortably inside legend. The celebrated shield maiden, the noble queen, and the mysterious seer became familiar symbols, while the countless women whose lives were shaped by relentless labor, impossible responsibility, or silent suffering remained hidden beneath the surface. When only the exceptional are remembered, what happens to everyone whose ordinary endurance made an entire civilization possible? The evidence uncovered during the last few decades has steadily challenged those simplified images, replacing certainty with complexity at every turn. Burials, household objects, trade records, genetic analysis, and surviving narratives all point toward the same conclusion. Viking society cannot be understood without recognizing that women's experiences differed dramatically according to status, birth, wealth, and circumstance, often more than popular culture has ever acknowledged. Instead of one story, we are confronted with dozens unfolding simultaneously beneath the same northern sky. Perhaps that complexity is the most valuable discovery of all, because history rarely rewards those who search for easy answers. The deeper we examine the lives of Viking women, the more we encounter a society capable of remarkable organization, extraordinary resilience, and profound cruelty existing side by side, without contradiction in the minds of those who lived within it. Rather than diminishing the Viking world, accepting that uncomfortable reality allows us to understand it with a depth that myths alone could never provide. As historians continue piecing together this world from scattered evidence, one fact becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The everyday lives of Viking women shaped the survival of their communities just as profoundly as the voyages that later captured the imagination of the world. While longships carried warriors across distant seas, countless decisions made inside farms and settlements determined whether families endured another winter, whether alliances remained intact, and whether the next generation would inherit stability or hardship. The famous expeditions may have expanded the Viking world, but what allowed that world to continue existing when the ships were gone? Every surviving object seems to answer that question in its own quiet way. A worn spindle speaks of endless hours transforming raw wool into valuable cloth. An iron key recalls the enormous trust and responsibility placed upon the woman who guarded a household's survival. And the remains of forgotten settlements reveal communities held together by routines that rarely found their way into heroic poetry. These discoveries remind us that history is not built only by extraordinary moments, but also by ordinary lives repeated day after day until they become the foundation upon which entire civilizations stand. Perhaps that is why the story of Viking women continues to challenge modern assumptions so powerfully, because it refuses to fit comfortably into simple categories of oppression or empowerment. Their world contained authority without complete freedom, respect alongside exploitation, and opportunities that often existed only because necessity demanded them rather than because society willingly granted them. The closer we come to understanding that contradiction, the closer we come to understanding the Viking Age itself, not as a legend carved into stone, but as a living society filled with human complexity, difficult choices, and lives far richer than the myths that survive them. The more carefully we examine the evidence, the more obvious it becomes that the Viking world survived not only because of daring voyages, but because an entire society continued functioning while so many of its men were absent for months or even years. Every season demanded planning, discipline, and resilience from those who remained behind, and the success or failure of that invisible work often determined whether returning ships would find thriving communities or abandoned settlements. History celebrated the journeys across the sea, but how often has it paused to honor the people who ensured there was still a home waiting when those journeys ended? That forgotten labor reminds us that endurance rarely announces itself with dramatic moments worthy of legend. More often, it appears in countless ordinary decisions made before sunrise, in supplies carefully rationed through another unforgiving winter, in children raised despite uncertainty, and in traditions preserved long enough to outlive the generation that first carried them. Those quiet victories seldom became the subjects of heroic songs. Yet without them, the stories of conquest and exploration could never have existed in the first place. Perhaps that is why the women of the Viking Age deserve to be remembered not as symbols created by modern imagination, but as individuals whose lives reflected every contradiction their society contained. Some exercised genuine authority, others endured unimaginable hardship, and many experienced both at different moments of the same life, proving that reality was always far more complex than the myths that followed. When we finally look beyond the legends and allow those contradictions to remain intact, we come closer not only to understanding the Viking world, but also to recognizing how easily every civilization chooses which voices deserve to survive through history and which are allowed to disappear into silence. Even after centuries of research, the Viking Age continues to surprise us because every new discovery has a way of overturning assumptions that once seemed unquestionable. The farther scholars dig beneath the soil of Scandinavia, the more they uncover a world where everyday life was defined less by heroic legends than by constant negotiation with hardship, uncertainty, and survival. What if the greatest misunderstanding about the Viking world has never been what we know, but what we have chosen to overlook? For a long time, popular imagination focused almost entirely on the dramatic image of warriors crossing rough seas beneath carved dragon heads, leaving little room for the countless lives unfolding quietly behind them. Yet every expedition that disappeared beyond the horizon depended upon settlements that continued functioning without interruption, where fields still had to be cultivated, livestock protected, supplies rationed, and children raised despite endless uncertainty. Those responsibilities rarely earned songs or monuments, but without them the famous voyages celebrated throughout history would never have been possible. Perhaps that is the most revealing contradiction hidden within the Viking world, because its greatest achievements rested not only upon those who ventured outward, but equally upon those who remained behind carrying burdens that history almost forgot to acknowledge. Their work rarely produced moments dramatic enough for legend, yet it quietly sustained an entire civilization through seasons of absence, danger, and relentless hardship. Once that invisible foundation comes into focus, every familiar image of the Viking Age begins to tell a far more complete and far more human story. The frozen landscapes of Scandinavia have preserved more than ancient wood, rusted iron, and weathered stone. They have also preserved uncomfortable questions that every generation must answer for itself. When we uncover another burial, another household, or another forgotten object, we are not simply learning about people who lived 1,000 years ago. We are confronting the values that shaped their world and asking whether our own societies have truly moved beyond them. How often do we still measure human worth according to usefulness, status, or power, while convincing ourselves that we have become more enlightened? That is why the story of Viking women refuses to remain trapped in the past, because beneath every archaeological discovery lies a reflection of choices that continue to echo across history. The woman guarding the family's supplies, the enslaved captive denied ownership of her own future, the skilled craftswoman whose work supported international trade, and the respected seer whose counsel influenced powerful leaders all revealed different faces of the same civilization, each shaped by rules they did not create. Together, they remind us that no society is ever defined by its strongest members alone, but equally by the lives of those whose struggles remain largely unseen. Perhaps the greatest value of looking back at the year 920 is not that it allows us to admire the Viking Age, but that it challenges us to question the stories we instinctively believe about every civilization, including our own. History becomes most meaningful when it refuses to flatter us, replacing comfortable myths with evidence that exposes both extraordinary resilience and profound injustice existing side by side. And once those forgotten voices finally begin to speak again, they leave us with a truth that is far more difficult to ignore than any legend ever told. As the final pieces of this story fall into place, one truth becomes impossible to escape. The Viking world was never built solely by the hands that held swords, but equally by those that carried keys, spun wool, remembered traditions, and endured losses that history rarely chose to record. Every household that survived another winter, every child raised while fathers vanished across distant seas, and every harvest protected through seasons of uncertainty formed part of the same invisible foundation beneath the legendary voyages. Without those quiet acts of endurance, the image of the fearless Viking would never have existed in the form we know today. The women of the year 920 were neither mythical heroines nor helpless figures waiting in the background of someone else's story, because their lives unfolded across a spectrum far too complex for simple labels to contain. Some exercised remarkable authority, others endured unbearable suffering, and many experienced both within the same lifetime, navigating a society that rewarded resilience while imposing limits they could never entirely escape. Is that not the reason their story still matters after more than 1,000 years? Because it reminds us that real history is always more complicated than the legends we prefer to remember? So when you picture that woman standing beside the cold waters of a Norwegian fjord, do not see only a symbol of the Viking Age, but a human being carrying hopes, fears, responsibilities, and burdens that crossed every season of her life without certainty of recognition. She deserves to be remembered not through romantic myths or simplified narratives, but through the full complexity that archaeology, history, and surviving traditions have slowly revealed over generations of discovery. And perhaps, after following her journey from beginning to end, you will never look at the Viking world, or at the forgotten people hidden behind history's greatest legends, in quite the same way again. If there is one final lesson hidden beneath the ice, the graves, and the fading echoes of the Viking Age, it is that history rarely disappears. It simply waits for someone willing to ask better questions. Every forgotten object recovered from the earth reminds us that entire lives can vanish from memory, not because they lacked importance, but because no one considered them worthy of preserving. How many other voices are still buried beneath the stories we have accepted without hesitation? The women who lived in the year 920 could never have imagined that people living more than a millennium later would search for traces of their existence through fragments of bone, worn iron, and scattered pieces of cloth. Yet those fragments have accomplished something remarkable, allowing us to rebuild a picture that is richer, more honest, and far more complicated than the legends passed down through generations. Instead of finding a world divided neatly between heroes and victims, we discover human beings adapting to circumstances that constantly demanded sacrifice, endurance, and impossible decisions. That may be the greatest reason to study the Viking world today, because its history does not simply describe another civilization. It challenges the assumptions we bring to every civilization we encounter. Once we understand how easily myth can overshadow reality, how quickly power can determine whose stories survive, and how often ordinary people become invisible despite carrying entire societies on their shoulders, we begin reading history itself with different eyes. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy left by the women of the Viking Age, not a legend carved into stone, but a reminder that the most important stories are often the ones that almost disappeared forever. Although the longships have long since disappeared from the northern seas, the questions they leave behind continue to challenge every generation that studies them. The deeper we examine the evidence, the clearer it becomes that the true legacy of the Viking Age cannot be measured only by battles won or territories explored, but by the countless lives that quietly sustained an entire civilization through years of uncertainty. Behind every celebrated voyage stood people whose names rarely survived, yet whose labor made those journeys possible from beginning to end. History often encourages us to search for extraordinary individuals while overlooking the ordinary people whose daily sacrifices shaped the course of nations. Viking women remind us that influence is not always visible, that resilience rarely announces itself through glory, and that survival can demand a kind of courage every bit as remarkable as standing on a battlefield with a weapon in hand. Once we begin looking beyond the legends, we discover that the strongest foundations of any society are often built by those history almost forgot to mention. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate so deeply after more than 1,000 years. It is not simply a story about Scandinavia, longships, or forgotten customs, but about the human tendency to celebrate visible power while overlooking invisible endurance until evidence forces us to see what was always there. And when we finally recognize those hidden lives for what they truly were, the Viking Age stops feeling like a distant legend and becomes something far more powerful, a reminder that the most meaningful chapters of history are often the ones we nearly allowed to disappear forever. The farther we travel through the surviving evidence, the more we understand that the Viking Age was never defined by certainty, but by constant adaptation to a world where nature, conflict, and social expectations left almost no room for weakness. Every season demanded difficult choices, every absence reshaped a household, and every decision carried consequences that could echo through generations. That reality applied to everyone. Yet women often bore those burdens in ways that remained largely invisible to the chronicles that later defined the age. It is tempting to imagine the past as simpler than the present, but the lives of Viking women reveal exactly the opposite. They navigated responsibilities that shifted with circumstance, balancing authority and dependence, privilege and vulnerability, respect and exploitation in combinations that cannot be reduced to a single narrative without losing the truth. Could any society built upon so many contradictions ever be understood through legends alone? Perhaps that is why archaeology has become such a powerful voice in rewriting this history, not by inventing new stories, but by allowing forgotten evidence to speak where written records remain silent. Every recovered grave, every household artifact, and every fragment preserved beneath Scandinavian soil reminds us that the past still contains countless lives waiting to be understood on their own terms rather than through the myths created long after they were gone. And with every discovery, the women of the Viking world step a little farther out of the shadows and back into the history they helped create.